But that's how much typing.
Wow.
But it's tiny writing.
Well, it's about this area, so it's related to that. These are some journals that my father wrote when he was in college, actually. And it's in 1932. And in 1932, he was working, it was for 3 months, and he was working up around McCall and Warren for the Forest Service. And he fought forest fires, and actually that year he worked building trails and so on. And then in 1932, he kept his journal for the full year, and it's in a 5-year journal. So each
Page only has 1 year.
this is one day for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different years.
Wow.
So he wrote, here's 1 day's worth of journal. This is September 12th, and this is 1932, 33, 34, but he didn't write in there on 34. So it's not a long journal that he wrote. So after this first part, which is the 1932 part, was just a plain envelope or plain notebook. It's not a big one, but these others, each day is very short. So there isn't a whole lot there.
He crammed a lot of tiny writing in that.
But he wrote.
It's so tiny you'd have to use a magnifying glass sometimes
read it.
and ask me words over and over. But the thing I think is so cool about just a little bit, you know, sometimes you want to write a lot about what happened one day, but he'd just have little short sentences, and you have to take a picture of the week or two to kind of get the humdrum of his life, you know. And it just kind of went on with coming over from school and work, going over to see Margaret, his mother, who he dated for a long time, but in those days you had to finish college
before you got married.
ever
Well, let me
and be able to
finish. Let me
support a-
talk about
Yes,
it.
I got excited as he was doing it.
All right, so the first year, he talked about fighting fires up here in the mountains just up above Boise. He went up there, he owned a car, it was a Model A Ford. It cost him $7 to get from Logan to Boise
What?
for gas.
Cost us what?
And then he went from here up to McCall and got 4 flat tires between here and McCall.
Wow.
And so he talked quite a bit about that.
And it was a 12-hour trip that day.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a full day to drive up there. Wow.
So,
And the road was probably the same quality back then.
I don't imagine it's changed much.
one of the things that's fun is that he wrote about my mother virtually every single day.
He kind of liked her.
He was dating her. He met her through her brother, who was one of his close friends. And for instance, on Friday, January 1st, 1932, he says, saw New Year's Day in at Hyde's, that's my mother's place, kissed Margaret for the first time this year.
Wait a minute, so had he kissed her previously?
For the first time this year.
It was New Year's Day.
This is January 1st.
Yeah.
So,
He's keeping tally.
He's starting out the count. He's starting out the count.
and
That's not when
on,
he first met her. That's
that
not
was, he had been known her quite well.
it was on the first day.
On January the 2nd, he said, let's see, let me just start here. Spent the evening with Margaret. She said she wouldn't marry me for 3 years. Now, but you have to understand that he was 2 years, he was a year more in college, and then he was going to go 2 years on his mission. So you have to read into this to understand
Why she
exactly
wouldn't marry him.
what he's saying about this.
So when you don't know about this part of the life of your parents, it's so fun to find out this.
So Ben, if your mother had told me this, you would just now be turning 40.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
Just a second, Dee. Here's an email from Dan's Emily saying
They're hanging out with.
They're all hanging out with Uncle John and making Aunt Jean's pizza.
Oh, wonderful.
So where does Uncle John live?
He's my brother, and he lives in New York. But he came through here to see my mom.
How neat. And
Okay.
and Emily belongs to whom?
Dan,
Dan.
Dan's
And
wife.
they're in New York right now?
No, they're in
visiting?
Price.
Oh, 'cause they
Family,
came here.
Price.
So they're
John.
here.
Yeah,
now
John's
they're down
over
to
here.
Price. Okay. Cool.
Okay.
So what we're hearing here is that family is pretty important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Heavenly Father's organization is the family. We're all a part of His family.
Yep.
And we're all a part of families here on this earth. We're all really a family, but you're a family. We're a family. Ben's a family.
Yeah.
You guys are a family. So that's a special thing to
Yeah.
think about. But let me just finish this a little bit more. So 1 year he worked up here fighting fires, 1 year building trails, 1 year he was on a lookout tower.
Did you write a lot more that year?
He wrote the same amount each time. But the thing to realize is that this was during the Depression. And it was a dramatic experience for everyone who lived at that time.
Yeah.
I have in the back here some stuff that I got from Wikipedia about the Depression and the effect that it had on the people that lived through it.
Yeah.
And that adds a lot to some of the things that we hear here. Dad went through 4 years of college, graduated in forestry and range management, and figured that he was going to go to work full-time for the Forest Service. But the government had a requirement that they couldn't hire any full-time people because they were trying to reach money out to, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, if you've heard of that, where they hired unemployed men and put them in camps, hundreds of camps all over doing conservation stuff. There were 5 or 6 camps in Utah, for instance. But Dad graduated from high school, or from college, and he graduated with honors, but he couldn't get a job. He finally got a job for the summer up in Council, Idaho, building roads. He was a crew chief for a bunch of guys that were working on the roads that were up there. Then, at the end of that time, it was a 30-day or 90-day period, and then he lost his job. And he finally looked all over for a job. Here he was, graduating with honors from Utah State.
Can't get a job.
And he found a job
That's
working
really
for the Tennessee Valley Authority, doing the same kind of a thing, a supervisor for a crew of people back there. That's the only job he could get.
Boy.
And he describes, and I won't read it here,
So he
How-
left Margaret here.
he left and it took him 3 days in a train to get back there. And he describes the trip back. And then he describes the work that he did building dams across washes and all these kinds of things back there so that the Tennessee Valley area would be better agricultural ground. And he was back there and he was pretty lonely.
I bet.
Oh, and he couldn't go on a mission because his parents.
Oh, his brother was on a mission, and his brother came back, but his family told him, his father told him, we can't afford to send you on a mission. He was supposed to go right as soon as his father got back, his brother got back, and he couldn't go on a mission. And when Margaret said that she wouldn't marry him for 3 years, what she was saying is 1 more year of college and 2 years on the mission, and then I'm going to get married to you.
Yeah.
And finally, where are we at? Finally, he was working back in
Tennessee.
I don't know.
I mean, look here. I've got some notes about this one thing I'd like to.
I just love how you just get the feeling of what their life is like.
Yeah.
As you pick out each day. I think it's kind of fun.
Finally, he describes he was out there working, and he was still writing Mom all of the time, his girlfriend. And he got a letter, or he got a telegram offering him a job in New Mexico, which was a lot closer to home than Tennessee.
Yeah.
And he took this telegram to his boss. And you have to read, they're just little tiny bits that he writes. He took this telegram to his boss, and he told his boss that he could, he wanted to get married, and if he went back to there, he could stop and get married. Well, his boss said, well, wait a minute. You're working for crew, and you have to live in a tent in a camp. What I'll do is move you to another camp, and let you work in town, or live in town, and you can go bring your wife out here, or bring your girlfriend and get married, and live in town and work in that tent, in that camp.
Yeah.
And so he finally agreed to that. And here he got an apartment in La Follette, and he was living in it and said he really liked it well. Then finally on December 4th, 1933, his note says, it got up at 9 a.m., met the 9 a.m. La Follette bus. Margaret was on it. She was very tired and discouraged. Didn't think much of Tennessee. Rested at our apartment until 2, and then started for Atlanta. He borrowed a car from his friend because he didn't own a car back there. And they started for Atlanta, ate at Knoxville, then drove through without trouble. Reached Atlanta at 11:15, stopped at Hotel Ansley. I don't know how they slept, they weren't married by that time. On Tuesday, December 5th, he wrote, up at 7:30, in touch with Apostle Callis. Now, Apostle Callis had been mission president of the Southern States Mission for 10 years. And he had just been called as an apostle, and he had been back and ordained, and then he was back in Atlanta, Georgia, finishing off all of his stuff, and then he was going to go to Salt Lake. So he says, he had already written her. I haven't mentioned that. He had written him a letter and said he wanted him to get married to before he was called to be an apostle. And so he says, up at 7:30 on December 5th, in touch with Apostle Callis, went to his place at 10:30, and he took us to the courthouse, and we got a marriage license to the LDS Church, where he married us at noon exactly. Left Atlanta and drove here, Chattanooga. It was very pretty. And then on the next day, December 6th, he says, got up late and started out, drove slowly north through Chattanooga, took a different highway to see new country. It was very pretty. Picked up Margaret's luggage at Knoxville. Home at 4:30. Didn't have any trouble whatsoever. The next day he had to go back to work.
Isn't that interesting that those are the people, he had such little space to write,
Right.
and he says
He
it's
chose
very
those.
pretty, and we had no trouble. Like, those were worries.
This is the important thing.
Yeah.
But the day after he got back into La Follette, he had to go to work. So they wouldn't let him take time off to go to Logan to get married. And they almost didn't let him take time enough off to go down to get married in Georgia. This was in December.
This is surprising. 3 months, was it 3 months later that he got his job offer?
And this was in December. in February, he got, they had a, I might mention another thing. They decided that they couldn't just not hire anybody for the federal government. So they wrote a bunch of tests because they had thousands of people out of regular employment. How are they going to pick the ones to give them jobs to, like for the Forest Service and so on? Well, they had a test that they devised, and anybody who wanted to be a ranger in a national park took this test, and then they would pick from those people the ones that they would hire. And Dad took that test, and he took one for a Forest Service people. He got, out of the thousands of people across the country, he got the 4th highest score in the country. Now, I'm sure he wasn't the only one who got that score, but he got the 4th highest score. And he described taking that test. It was an all-day test. He took it in late November in Tennessee.
Did he say what kinds of questions?
He didn't say anything because he had that much space. That was all. But
Took a test, period.
he said they said it was going to take all day, and I was through with it in 3 hours. He says, I thought I did terribly on it. And yet he got 4th highest in the country. Then, in February of 1934, so that's from December 5th to February, he got a letter offering him a job in Miles City, Montana. And it would be a full-time job working for the Forest Service, doing research on a research program they had back there. So he quit there, bought himself a car, drove down to Florida, and then across Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas and New Mexico and through Arizona, and stopped. He describes.
I wondered how he didn't go up to Montana, but he was going to go home first, right?
Well, they had never been to those countries, those states.
Yeah.
And so he decided they wanted to make a trip for themselves, and that's how they went. And my mother's brother was at a CCC camp down by Cedar City, and they were the ones that drilled that highway, the tunnel through Zion's.
Yeah.
And he was there, and went through it the very first 3 months or so that tunnel was open. He met my uncle, and then they drove up. He came up with them to Logan. They spent a couple of days in Logan, and then he describes the drive up to Miles City, Montana, and they couldn't find an apartment in Miles City, but they had a little old building on the spot where he was doing his research, way out in the middle of the
Forest or the tree.
well, actually, it was the prairie out there, because it was out in the prairie, not in the mountains there. And they made it up so that they could live in that for a house. He bought a bunch of furniture. And he lived there and worked there for about 3 or 4 months. And he describes what he did and his and Mom's time together. Then they went down to Logan, and he got another job. He never told me about this, at a place called Twin Bridges, Montana. And he was there for about 2 months, and then his journal ends. And I don't know why he went to Twin Bridges, and I looked at it on a map. It's a little teeny tiny town, but he says he went from Montana to be an assistant ranger at the supervisor's area for the whole Mountain West, which was in Ogden. And he was there for a few months, and then he went up to Montpelier, or St. Anthony, Idaho, and he was the ranger up there. And then I had a sister who was born dead because of some problems that Mom had. And then he was sent down to Logan, or to Escalante as a ranger, and that's where I was born. Now I don't have that in the journal, But
But you know that happened.
I know that happened.
We
So-
probably can't tell his whole life history,
But that's
but
a little bit about.
it's fun.
That's awesome.
That is awesome.
And he went on to be a forest ranger and all over, and then
During World War II, there people didn't have maps of Southern California, and they were sure the Japanese were going to invade there where it was flat, you know. So they drafted Dad, because he knew about maps and so on, to go down there, and they developed a method of making aerial photographs flying over, and then they had a machine they invented, which Dad learned to run, and they mapped Southern California in case the Japanese invaded. Then they went up to Northern California and did that. Then I lived in different places. Now I was in kindergarten during that time in 3 places. I went to, Dad then went back to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and the government, or the American government, was in the process of attacking islands in the South Pacific that were controlled by the Japanese. Well, they made frogmen move into the island. They'd sneak onto the island, and they would survey 2 spots on the island, and the distance and the angle between them. Then they flew over with airplanes and made the photographs, and those 2 spots were the controls, so that they knew how big things were on the ground. And then Dad mapped each island that they attacked, one after the other. Now the Japanese, I'm sure, didn't know where he lived and where they were doing this back in Gettysburg, or they'd have done something about it, because it was top secret.
Yeah.
And nobody could get into his office even. And but after that, he worked in mapping rather than in forestry, and he spent the rest of his life. And we traveled all over, and we lived in places like Gettysburg and Arlington, Virginia, and so on.
Yeah.
With him doing mapping. And then the last years of his life, he worked for the State Department and went to places like Nepal and Cambodia and helped teach the people there how to map their national forest timber reserves and stuff. And that's where he was. He finally retired from that.
Yeah, in fact, he was in Cambodia when we met and got married.
And he couldn't come back, so.
Different life. I mean, his life is so different than Ben's and Jim's. I mean, just
And yet-
entirely different.
And it tells me that your young lives now
Are
as
just as
valuable
important, yes.
to be written down in
And
little
years
bits
from now, your
for
kids
when
will.
kids like us
Yeah.
are old and going to say, oh, look what they did. I'm so glad to know this. He did write a life history, so Larry knows a lot of his life because he wrote
Yeah,
life history.
Actually, Ben had it
And Ben
published.
is the one that helped to get that all typed up and in the
Well, he
book.
typed it up. I just saved it.
Yeah.
You just saved it.
Erase.
You get
You
the
erase
credit.
out
Good job with
the
that.
printed.
You have to reformat it though.
I've never met the man. Okay.
Okay,
It's
so
all the same.
you have some,
They were on
some history from your dad.
right? You had to redo it.
It was saved in an old
So this is, I guess,
Word
a lesson
Perfect
to-
format, like a
Yeah,
really
it's
early one.
important to keep it.
And I
Yeah.
found a tool online
So
that converted it so we could actually read it.
The
So
thing
that's
to
your
realize
great grandpa.
No sick
What a
leave.
different life is yours.